Okay, so today we're gonna talk a little bit about some theories of population growth. Last time we discussed some of the facts. We talked about the how the economic development process leads to like a demographic transition, where essentially we see like a decrease in mortality rates initially, and then a decrease in fertility rates over time. And so perhaps the oldest and most famous theory of how the economy interacts with population growth is due to Malthus. Malthus was writing, he was an economist in the 17th or 18th century. So he was writing before industrial revolution times when population was relatively stable. And so essentially the idea of a Malthusian trap back then referred to a situation where because there are decreasing returns in the production of agricultural food, as population starts to grow, the amount of food production starts to grow, but because there's decreasing returns to scale, as you start using more land, new land is less productive than the old land, and so essentially the food production is not able to keep up with population growth. The idea is population tend to grow exponentially, whereas food production can grow at most linearly if you assume constant productivity or perhaps less than that. And so essentially what happens is that population growth ends up overcoming the amount of food available. This leads to food shortages. The food shortages essentially lead to either famines, which lead to disease or conflict. People start fighting over the food, wars, essentially increasing the death rate either from disease or war and conflict. And so you have this type of transition where population grows faster than what you can produce food. This leads to this kind of like increase in death rate due to famine, disease, and conflict and war. And this brings the population back down. And so eventually you end up getting population back down, and the economy cannot sustain long-term population growth. Some of these ideas have been adapted to the modern settings to think about developing world. And the idea is that if the increase in population growth, you can we can describe this in an equilibrium where the economy is in a low level of income. If income starts to grow, then better nutrition and reduction of death rates increases population growth. And this increase in population growth is faster than in the increase in growth of output, and so per capita income actually goes back down, and you end up back in the same situation you were in initially. This is the idea of a Malthusian trap, that low-income countries will be stuck in those low level of income, because as soon as they start growing, this leads to a reduction in death rates, and this leads to very fast population growth, which in turn brings income per capita back down. And so the question is, how do you get out of this trap? And the answer can be perhaps due to technological progress or other factors. So we can kind of represent these ideas in a graph. This graph is from the book, where we have two curves. One curve represents the relationship that we described in that transition, demographic transition that we talked about last time, where initially, as income per capita starts to grow, this makes population growth fast due to a decrease in death rates up to this point, where the fertility rate starts to decrease, and then population growth starts to slow down again. And this other curve essentially shows you the relationship that as income per capita is higher, this tends to bring the economy closer to a steady state where income growth rate will be essentially constant. And so you can think of this as the relationship between income per capita and income growth. And it's a kind of positive relationship for low level of income. There's increasing returns or low or high marginal productivity of capital, and so you can increase and grow the income pretty much at increasing rates until you get to this point where at high level of income per capita, the income growth is constant. And so when you look at these situations that are in equilibrium, is where these two curves interact in terms of income per capita being constant. The growth rate of income per capita here is the difference between these two. Remember, the income per capita is income divided by population, and so the growth rate of income per capita is the growth rate of income minus the growth rate of population. And so you can see that if you're at a point like here, where the growth of income is bigger, for this level of income per capita, the growth of income is above the growth rate of population. So this will lead to an increase in income per capita. You'll move in this direction towards point S. S is an equilibrium. If you start with income per capita S, the growth rate of the population is exactly equal to the growth rate of income, and so income per capita is constant, and you stay there. Now, this is the low income per capita equilibrium, and the idea of a Malthusian trap here in this graph is that if you move a little bit above, let's say, to an income per capita over here, because, as we said, the reduction in mortality rates will lead to an increase in the population growth rate that is bigger than the increase in income growth rate, and so this will lead to a reduction in income per capita, and it will push you back to S. And so for that reason, S is not only an equilibrium, but it's a stable equilibrium in the sense that if you perturb this equilibrium a little bit, you go a little bit above that, or even a lot above to over here, this will push you back down. There's another equilibrium, and the idea of the Malthusian trap is how can we end up making the economy jump to this equilibrium here, where now here, if you're at T, you actually, now this would be an unstable equilibrium, but that's a different issue. But essentially now you have a high income per capita. If you start with income per capita T, then the growth rate of population, because of the reduction in fertility, now has gone back down, and it's exactly equal to the growth rate in income, and income per capita essentially remains constant. Okay, so this is not supposed to be like an exact description of an economy, but just to help you put a little bit of structure on this idea of a Malthusian population trap. And you can see we talk about some of these somewhat draconian measures of population control. Other less draconian measures include distribution of condoms or other form of birth control, and try to control population. Okay, so this is essentially one of the ways we can think about population growth. Through also technological growth, perhaps we could bring the curve of how income is related to income per capita up, and so we don't have these two equilibria anymore. Essentially, we can allow for the economy to get out of the Malthusian trap. Now, what are some of the criticisms of this model? Well, essentially, is that it's not when Malthus wrote back in the 18th century. There was not much technological progress. Technology evolved very slowly. People have been doing agriculture. Perhaps the biggest technological progress was the invention of agriculture, more like 4,000 years before that. And so the invention of the wheel, the big technological leaps before that were, taking place long time before that. And so people had essentially been producing domestication of animals like the horse and so on. And so technology has been more or less constant, and he was right. Now, when you look at what happened, and we talk a little bit in the introduction, places like India, with the Green Revolution, we can see that actually India had more famines in the 1960s than in the 1990s. And this had to do with the fact that even though the population increased greatly during that time in India, India went through the Green Revolution, which essentially involved in modernizing agriculture and increasing agricultural productivity greatly. And so if you have an increase in productivity, this Malthusian idea that the population is going to grow faster than the capacity of producing food will not be really what happens. And that is India is a great example of that. And so that's the main criticism of this model. And so there might be other determinants for income, for the determinant of population growth in addition to income, like inequality, household income, and other circumstances. And so there's some criticism for this model, but the main one I would say in terms of economics is about the fact that it doesn't take into account the possibility that you just get better at producing food over time, and that increase in productivity more than compensates the increase in population. An alternative theory was kind of proposed in the 1960s and 70s by Gary Becker and other economists, is the idea that people, is what's called the modern microeconomic theory of fertility, which essentially tries to explain the fact of why, as the economy becomes wealthier, people tend to have less children. And it's going to think about it in terms of the model of rational choice that you may have studied in microeconomics classes. And so the idea is that people are going to make a choice to maximize their utility. And just like they consume, parents, just like they decide how many tomatoes to eat or how much to invest in their human capital, they're also going to make a choice on how many children to have, because they derive some kind of pressure for children. And so, back in traditional societies or in low-income countries today, children can also serve as an investment because they have labor, and they also can act as insurance when children, when you get old, they can help you in your old age when there are no pension system in place. But you can think of beyond a certain number of children. So the first 2 or 3 children are consumer goods that you just have those kids because you enjoy them. And then beyond that, you can think them as investment goods, which can work in your farm and can serve an old age security insurance. And essentially, from this analysis, we can derive what is the demand for children based on the price, the price maybe including the opportunity cost of the mother, of having to spend all this time raising the children, and so on and so forth. And so we can think of, I don't want you to go too crazy about this diagram, but some of you have taken microeconomics. You can think of a world where there's only 2 goods, the number of children, and the other goods consumed, and you're going to have a budget constraint based on your income and the relative price of having children relative to other goods, which essentially will involve the cost of raising children, which includes the opportunity cost of the time spent in raising children by the mother and the father, and the cost of perhaps paying for their food, their clothing, and so on and so forth. And so you can see, just like within microeconomics, how as the price of having children goes up, and for example, we move from this AB budget line, we will move to this budget line, then people have indifference curve that describe their preference for having children, how much they like children, how much they like consuming other goods, and then they will make a optimal choice on how to reduce the number of children they want to have as the price of children goes up, for example. Also, as the income that the family has, as you can see, and you move from a point like F to a point like H, maybe people start to have more children initially, but then you could have a situation where both of those changes are taking place at the same time. People have more income as a society is wealthier, and that will lead to people perhaps to have more children if children are normal goods. So it will be like moving from point F to point H, but also at the same time, because now mothers could work and wages go up, the opportunity cost of having children goes up as the society develops and become wealthier. And so that would also increase the relative price. So at the same time, the curve, the budget constraint is moving up, and it's also getting steeper. And so you can end up in a point like G, where you end up actually choosing to have less children. And that would be essentially the basic story of why, as the economy becomes wealthier, people tend to have less children, which is on the one hand, as people are wealthier, they would like to have more children because they like children. But on the other hand, the opportunity cost of having children goes up as the economy becomes wealthier, because the economy, on the one hand, having children becomes more expensive. You need to pay for their education, send them to college, and so on and so forth. And also the opportunity cost of the mother, as wages go up, goes up. The time involved in raising children becomes more costly. And so that factor essentially is what pushes the demand for children down. And people end up, as sometimes it's said, deciding to have switching for quantity of children for quality of children, where quality refers to the amount of money you invest per child. And so instead of having 6 children to work on your field, now you're going to have 2 children that you're going to send to college and invest a lot of money in their education. Okay, so that's the basic idea. We can think of this, if you found the graph, as you can think of a demand for children, that essentially it depends on your income, on the price of having children, on the price of other goods, and also on the taste of how much you like children relative to consuming other goods. And so how does this demand depend on each factor? Well, the income level is somewhat unclear because you have an income. So on the one hand, children may be a normal good, as I was saying, so to have more children as you have more income, you want to have more children because you enjoy them. But on the other hand, as I was saying, as your income goes up, let's say your wage goes up, then the opportunity cost of your time also goes up, which is measured by your wage, right? Because if you're not raising your children, you could be earning a wage. And so the wage measures the opportunity cost of the time you spend raising your children. And so as income goes up, it also increases the opportunity cost of time. And that will lead to lower your demand for children. So the effect of income is somewhat unclear. As we have seen the data, increases in income level tend to decrease in the data the fertility rate, the number of children that people have. Obviously, the price of having children, if the cost of education, for example, goes up, you think people will have less children, or if the opportunity cost, let's say now mothers decide to go to work, and so they earn higher wages in the society. Now the opportunity cost of mothering goes up, and so people have less children. Now, the higher the prices of other goods relative to children, that will increase the demand for children, because children is an easier way of getting satisfaction if you want. The more you like having children, the more children you will have. That's pretty obvious. Mortality rate will act positively in the sense that you care about the demand for surviving children, if you want. So if you think of half of your kids are going to die and you would like to have 2 kids, then you're going to have 4 kids. If you think all of your kids are going to survive, then you only have the 2 kids you want. And so mortality rate, in some sense, gets taken into account in that way. You can think of it as you care about the number of surviving children. And so if mortality rates are high, you will have more kids to compensate for that. That's what I was saying. Increasing female employment opportunities increases the opportunity cost of mothering, and so that will lead to more children. Okay. So this is what we call the microeconomic theory of fertility, and it has some implications in terms of policy. If you want to lower fertility, you could raise women's education role and status. You can encourage more female non-agricultural wage employment, which will increase the opportunity cost of mothering. You could increase family income levels. You could reduce infant mortality. You could also develop an old age and social security pension system, which will reduce people's demand for children as insurance against old age, and expanded schooling opportunities as well will increase the cost of having children because you have to pay for the schooling. And so all of these things will reduce fertility. And this sometimes is referred to as the quality-quantity trade-off, the fact that as people income increase, people tend to have less children. It was first kind of proposed by Gary Becker from the University of Chicago, where he says that as income increases and mortality falls, parents prefer to have higher quality, better educated, richer children as opposed to higher quantity, which is more useful at low income levels and high mortality rates. Okay, so that's the key idea of the microeconomic theory of fertility. Now, the basic question that still remains to be addressed is population growth a problem? Well, there's essentially 2 camps on this. Some people say that's not a real problem, but it's more of a essentially a consequence of real problems. The real problems are underdevelopment, unfair income distribution, high poverty, and so on. So people focus on overpopulation too much because it's a way of kind of shying away from the more real problems. Population growth is a desirable phenomenon to a certain extent. And the idea here is that population growth is a symptom of poverty, not the cause. Other issues are the cause. We have discussed many. Once you have ridden yourself of the other causes of poverty, then population and income starts to rise, then naturally you will have a reduction in population growth. And so here's a few things, like people need to work. So younger population means larger workforce. So that's good to have population growth. We talk about old age dependency ratio. When you have an old population, that puts pressure on the pension insurance system. Prices will also adjust. For example, if there's too much population and food scarcity becomes an issue, then the price of food will go up. You will increase the cost of having children. It will give an incentive to grow more food, and so on and so forth. In places like Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, only 10 to 20% of usable land is used. So there's a lot of extensive margin in which you can increase the food production. Technology, as Malthus kind of ignore, and the case in India, for example, Green Revolution suggests can resolve a lot of these population growth issues. And so also the strain that population growth puts on resources may increase the incentive to innovate and solve those problems. And so population may be a desirable phenomenon. On the other camp, you have people, if you saw the video by the New York Times, talk about Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb. We have some extremist arguments. Some, have to do with the environment, have to do with famines, poverty, migration, frictions, and so on and so forth. So if you saw like what is going on in the southern border of the United States, and some of those issues, I encourage you to watch the video for more on this. Okay. So despite the conflicting opinions, there is some common ground. Population is not the primary cause of lower living standards, but maybe a factor. Population growth is more a consequence than a cause of underdevelopment. Once again, it's not the same having population growth in Canada, but we also got to look at having population growth in Democratic Republic of Congo. People may be having being born into very different circumstances, and essentially one of the key ways in which you can reduce fertility is through economic development. And so that's why, for example, in China, you have seen as China developed and the economy started to grow, the one-child policy was phased out, because people by themselves will choose to have less children, and it doesn't have to be a force. Some policy approaches look at underlying socioeconomic conditions that impact development, family planning problems, which have been somewhat productive, anything that helps increase productivity, and well, a few others. I don't want to spend too much time. I'll let you read about this on the book if you're interested. Developing countries can also play a role by encouraging education in the developing world, financing family planning programs, raising the socioeconomic status of women, increase employment opportunities for women, and in particular, as we have seen, the most effective thing can be done is to help facilitate economic development, and economic development will naturally reduce high fertility rates. So if you're worried about Sub-Saharan Africa having high fertility rates, help Sub-Saharan African countries develop economically and become wealthier, and that would naturally reduce fertility rate. All right, so let me just finish here. So next we're going to start talking about urbanization, but for now, please just finish up reading on population issues. Thank you.